Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Iqra Book Festival 2022. This is the third consecutive year of the Iqra Book Festival running. Those of you who have been with us all day have been enjoying a range of different authors being interviewed. Up next, I have the pleasure of introducing Jahan Mahmood, who's a Birmingham-based historian and consultant. While he specialises in military history, he has a wealth of knowledge in the field of counter-terrorism. From 2010 to 2013, Jahan advised the British government on security matters. His research on the impact of Western foreign policy domestically and internationally in the process of radicalisation has added to the debate on ideology versus foreign policy. Jahan has featured on mainstream news channels and was a regular guest on BBC, Sky, RT and Channel 4. Welcome, Jahan.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Mirk. I'm a journalist, and I'm the author of the book Guantanamo Voices. I'll show you here. And this book is a work of comics journalism, and it's about the world's most infamous prison, Guantanamo Bay. And I have a short presentation I'm going to do about the book. It's about 15 minutes long, and then Jahan and I are going to talk about it. He's going to ask me some questions. So I'll start that presentation now.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, please. Go ahead with your introduction.
Great. Yeah. So I'm a journalist and I work, in all different sorts of mediums. I used to work in more traditional print media, like writing for magazines and newspapers. And in 2017, I started making comics full time. So I make, doing journalistic comics that are about real life. And I'm going to do this little presentation about Guantanamo Voices and the power of comics journalism. So here we go. And I edited this book. It's based on 10 different interviews that I did with different people at Guantanamo Bay who are in different capacities. So some attorneys, some people who've been in prison there, as well as people in the military. And then those interviews are illustrated by different artists. So each chapter is illustrated by a different artist. It's a different voice and it's a different visual voice in the book. I'm not the only comics journalist. Sometimes people haven't heard of the medium before. So I just wanted to share this page of other comics journalism that has inspired me. If you're looking for more nonfiction comics, these are all books that I recommend. I think it's important to say that my work is inspired by people that came before me and started making comics journalism years before I did, and I was really inspired by their work and effort. So Guantanamo Bay is an American military base and prison on the south side of Cuba. Here it is on Google Maps, which helpfully notes that prison is still open for business. I think that comics journalism is really powerful because it can challenge dominant narratives in some creative ways. A dominant narrative is a story that society tells about a topic. So what's like the mainstream story that's heard most often about this topic? And at Guantanamo Bay here in the United States, the story that's told most often about the prison is told by the government. They set the tone for how we talk about Guantanamo when the prison first opened. And this is what the government says about Guantanamo, that it's a safe, humane, and legal detention facility that's necessary to save American lives. So that's the story that's told about Guantanamo that most Americans believe and agree with. But another story you can tell about it is that the United States has imprisoned hundreds of Muslim men from around the world without trial for years. This is totally true, but it's not something that most Americans think of when we think of Guantanamo Bay. So I saw my work with this book as trying to challenge that dominant narrative that was told by the government and instead say, hey, here's what's actually happening. Here's the reality of this place and the impact that it's had on so many people. So if you haven't heard anything about Guantanamo, you probably know just this one photo. This is the photo that most Americans have seen of the prison. It was taken in 2002 when the prison first opened. It's the only thing I knew about the prison until I met this person, Chris Arendt, who was a veteran who served at Guantanamo Bay. So they joined the military to get money to go to college and then wound up getting deployed to Guantanamo Bay as a prison guard. They felt really conflicted about their experiences. And when they came home, they started doing advocacy and speaking out about their experiences and wound up getting invited to go to England to go on a speaking tour with members of a group called CAGE, which is a group of former prisoners who have been released from Guantanamo Bay who are now doing advocacy around the prison. So on the left here, we have someone named Jarla Almari, and on the right, that's Mozambique, who I'm sure that many of you know. And we traveled around England doing a speaking tour, Chris and these former prisoners. I just thought this was really, really incredible to have a former guard and former prisoners be able to like find community together and find a common humanity and interests that they could share and discuss was really, really powerful. So I went with them and I kept a blog of the trip. Please don't judge my 2008 web design skills. This is the best I could do. I was just making this on my own and at age like 22. So I kept this blog of the trip called Guantanamo Voices, where I just documented what was happening and how it was making me feel. And these stories really blew my mind. And I thought they were something that everyone should know about and that everyone should think about when they think about Guantanamo. And I immediately saw this as a graphic novel, as being something that we should tell with comics. But I didn't have any of the skills that I needed to make a book at that time. Here's some drawings from my sketchbook at that time. I thought it was really powerful to have it be a comic and to show sort of here's what was happening. But I didn't know anybody who'd ever made a book. I didn't have an agent. I didn't know anybody in publishing. I didn't have the skills that I needed to make a book-length comics project at that time. So basically over the next 10 years, I worked on other projects. I kept reporting on Guantanamo, but eventually was able to put together a book pitch and get an agent, send it to a publisher. And it took about 10 years before I was able to actually make a book proposal for this and sell it and be like, okay, I can make this book. I thought it would be a comic because comics have a really unique power to make the invisible visible. You're literally seeing it on the page. And the United States has tried to make Guantanamo invisible. Here we try and actually make all prisons invisible. We put them in very, remote areas and limit access to them. But Guantanamo is even more invisible than other places. Access to the prison is really limited by the government. And as a journalist, you can't even talk to anybody who's currently imprisoned there. So even journalists can't interview people who are currently in Guantanamo Bay, and that's helped keep it invisible. So I think that comics help make that visible in a really real way. So in 2019, I applied to go to Guantanamo as like a press tour that's organized by the military. This is the only way that journalists can go to the prison, is like sort of at the with the okay of the military. And so here's some reference photos that I took along on the trip. And what I was trying to do here is capture places that when I know might be drawn in the comic. And what I'm trying to do is make the place feel real, make it feel visible, be like, this is a real place full of real people. So this is us like getting off the plane there. All these little details that help show this is a base that's full of people. That's a real place full of real people. It's, these are the people that work there. Here's what they look like. I know that this is going to be captured on the page as the comic. There's thousands of people that work at Guantanamo Bay. So it's basically just like a small American town, complete with like, people that love to go running. There's a McDonald's there. When I was there, the library was hosting an escape room, which is an irony that I couldn't have made up. I was like, wow, you guys are doing this. There's also a gift shop there because it's a military base. All military bases, around the world have it from the United States have like little like souvenir shops essentially where you can buy stuff that's branded with the name of the base. But at Guantanamo, of course, it feels like dystopian and like cursed. Here's a Disney Minions shirt with Guantanamo Bay on it. And I include these just to show that like, this feels like a super normal place to people in the United States. But it has this really dark, horrible reality of also being this prison where we've kept people for years and tortured them. So it's a very surreal experience being there because it feels like this is a normal American town and then there's this really dark element to it. This is a postcard from the gift store that inspired the cover of the book. So I wanted the cover to look like a postcard from Guantanamo Bay, and then it's undercut with these very violent details. So this is meant to show like, here's the image that we're being sold about this prison, and then here's the reality. When you look a little closer, it's actually there's all this violence going on. So this cover is meant to be surreal and disturbing in the same way that actually being there is surreal and disturbing. So after I did all my research, which involved like interviewing different people and reading every other book that's been written about Guantanamo Bay, I wrote a script for the book. So just like if you're working on a movie, you write a script for a comic. So here's the script for page 1 of the book. As you can see, it's broken down like panel by panel, page by page. And then I worked with all these different artists to draw each page of the book. So here's the first page drawn by artist Hazel Newlevant. These are the thumbnails. And then here's the pencils, the like second draft of them. And then we developed a color palette for the book. So although the book is 10 different artists, they all use the same colors. And this was meant to create sort of a unified look for the book. So although it's these 10 different styles, it should still feel like one whole book. And so I gave this color palette to each of the artists and said, hey, use these as your dominant colors. And I wanted the colors here to be a sunset tones color palette, both because that's the actual colors of the place. You know, Guantanamo is in the Caribbean, it's on the south side of Cuba, so it has these really rich tropical colors to it, but also because I wanted the book to feel inviting. I wanted to make it feel like something people could pick up and read and help and, you know, face this history and face this present reality without having it be too dark, too scary. A lot of the media about Guantanamo Bay is like orange and black, if you think of the colors. And so I wanted these colors to be more inviting, to say, you can pick up this book, you can read it, don't be too scared to face what we've done. So here's the final draft of that first page of the book. And as you can see, here's how those reference photos worked into it. So Hazel took those photos that I'd sent and then you know, used them to lay out the page here, including a selfie of me down there at the bottom. The other important thing about comics is that they can get around censorship. So like I said, access to Guantanamo Bay is really tightly controlled. So, and the language that we use around Guantanamo is very limited by the government. So for example, on this page in the comic, the person who's leading the tour, whose name is Commander Bashaw, he says, you know, this isn't actually even a prison, it's called a detention facility. And the people who are in prison there are not called prisoners, they're called detainees. All those kinds of jargon that they use to sort of obscure what this place actually is. And it was really nice to be able to make this as a comic where I can show that back and forth to show, you know, are you saying it's not a prison? Why would you use that language? I was able to insert myself, you know, as the narrator here to say, like, why would you use this language? What's going on there? And in that way can challenge the censorship here. There's also, you know, it's very hard to photograph or record film there. So people who try to do photography projects or video-based projects at Guantanamo hit a lot of walls because you're not allowed to record film or photos in the prison in most circumstances. And so as with doing comics, we can use comics to fill in the gaps where I don't have reference photos. So artists can draw stuff that happened years in the past. They can imagine what things would look like based on descriptions of them, can help get around that censorship that the government set up around photography and film. And then also comics capture a really strong emotional reality. People have a visceral reaction to comics. You know, when you see these drawings on the page, it creates a strong emotional response. You're seeing what people wear, you're seeing what they eat, you're seeing what their faces look like. I love this page by Tracy Chawan, detailing, you know, the experiences of an attorney named Alka Pradhan. I love in the fourth panel here, just how you can see the expression on Alka's face, this like sadness, this concern, this worry, that to me comes through really strong. And I feel a strong emotional reaction to that. And I think that that helps build empathy here in readers. This is the rough draft of the page and then the final version. And I think that, you know, you can see like how strong reaction a reader could have to this and how they might be able to identify with what Alka's feeling. Here's another chapter of the book. This is the experiences of Mozambique. It's illustrated by artist Omar Khoury. And here you can see that art style is totally different. It has a really raw feel. To me, this feels like really strongly, like very visceral, very dark. And you know, this chapter is pretty upsetting. This is Mozambique's experiences in the prison and being basically kidnapped by US military forces and taken there without knowing what was happening. And so I wanted an artist whose style matched that feeling, that intensity of Mozambique's story. So it feels raw, it feels dark. And then here's another chapter. This is the experiences of Mark Fallon, who was in the military. He's narrating this chapter, and the art is by Gerardo Alba, who's a Mexican artist. And I love this, you can see it's totally different feel for this chapter. This one's more explanatory. There's like a lot of facts, a lot of figures. We're laying out, here's how the prison was made, here's how these people wound up there. And so I want an artist whose work felt very like, I would call this clean and straightforward, to help lay out those facts and figures about like, here's how this happened. It's less of like a super intense personal emotional story and more of like setting up the details here. And then I think that comics can really help us face things that are hard to face. One reason why Americans don't know much about Guantanamo is because there's never a really good time to talk about it. It is a really dark story, and there's not a happy ending here. And so I think that, putting this in comics can really help us actually read this material. People will pick up a comic book when they wouldn't pick up a prose book on a topic. So, like I said, most Americans have only seen this one photo of Guantanamo. If they've seen anything, they've seen this one photo. And this was taken at Camp X-Ray, which is the first place that opened. And here's what it looks like now. So this camp is now totally overgrown. It's falling apart. It's like no one's in this particular part of the prison anymore, and it's really crumbling. And when I got to visit there, this felt to me like a metaphor for all of Guantanamo, that the United States is hoping that this will just basically go away, that it will dissolve into the background, and we'll never have to think about it again. And so I felt like my job there was documenting what's happening and trying to memorialize this place and recognize what we've done there, recognize what we continue to do there, because our country's not in a place where we're going to do something like build a memorial or keep this memory going. So that's what I saw as my job as a journalist, was documenting, witnessing, and preserving this, and helping us face it as a people. So here's just on one of the last pages that I'll show you. This is about a man named Matt Davis by the artist Alex Begues, and he's reflecting on this page that there's been no accountability for anything that happened at Guantanamo, and that I just wish we would learn from our history instead of repeating it. So that's my whole presentation.
Well, thanks for that, Sarah. That was fascinating. Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to get to the book now, which was, I like the way it was formatted, the way that you set it out. So to start off with, there was the introduction. There was the note on the language that you've clearly demonstrated, the difference between detainee and prisoner. So for instance, we would hear a lot about them being non-combatants. It was almost like the language was orchestrated and manufactured in a way for the American government to avert, or at least get out of, the kind of international human rights and convention, the Geneva Conventions, and how they were able to do that at an international level is something that I still find very difficult to understand. How powerful nations are able to do that. Same thing with the war on terror, for instance, and how the Iraq war was conducted, and then the language on the Iraqis as if they were aggressors. So you put that in very nicely. And then the Guantanamo facts, I really like the way that you set things out. So for instance, doesn't say, oh, right. It's one of the earlier pages where you have a breakdown of who is actually detained at Guantanamo in terms of nationalities. So you mentioned that citizens of 49 countries have been held there, and that the majority of them actually come from Afghanistan, 200 plus out of the 779 men, I believe it was, and then followed by Saudi Arabia and China as well, because I recall you mentioning the Uyghurs, and that's one community that you had a lot of interest in, but you were not able to interview anyone from the Uyghur community, and then 9 people from Britain. What's interesting is, I have stated to you before this interview, is that I know Muazzam Beg, and I know Manzoor Hadifi. He's on social media and I recall Muazzam Beg actually coming from Guantanamo. This is a guy that I knew from Birmingham, and when I first saw him at Central Mosque and he'd been released, his eyes were flickering at such a fast rate, and you could see this guy had been deeply traumatized. So one of the opening questions I'm sure everybody wants to know is, what kind of impact did a book like this in Guantanamo have on you as a person? How did it change you? And just the long-lasting impact of it, whether any traumas or, you know, pains, because you're literally dealing here with humans. You're being treated like animals to some regard.
Yeah, I would say writing this book was very, very stressful, and I should have like gone to therapy while writing it because I was just kind of like overwhelmed constantly thinking about some pretty horrible stuff. And I saw that as like my responsibility. You know, I was like, I can give 2 years of my life to being enmeshed in this horrible reality every day, and in a way to try and make this book, because so many people have suffered so much more. You know, for me, it's something I can choose to be involved in or not be involved in. And for people who are imprisoned there, people whose family members were imprisoned there, it's not something they can just choose to be involved in. So I saw it as like my responsibility. I can give 2 years of my life to you know, being involved in this horror every day. But it was not like mentally great. I was also pretty isolated while writing the book. You know, I don't have like a community of people who really care about Guantanamo around me. So, you know, the people that I found that care most deeply about Guantanamo, who I talked to for the book, are people who work on like human rights advocacy, lawyers, and veterans. And so I did have a few people I could talk to about it, but mostly it made me feel like very angry. Like, why don't more people care about this? You know, in the United States, it's not something like most people in the United States support Guantanamo. They think the prison should stay open.
Right.
And most people in the United States, when you do polls, like are more supportive of torture now than they were 10 years ago. So the message that's gotten out to people in the United States is torture works and Guantanamo is a good idea. So when I'm doing this research, it makes me feel insane. Like, why, you know, am I the crazy one here? Like, I think this is really, really bad. I think that we need to take accountability for this. I think we need to take action on this as soon as possible. And it's a pretty lonely life thinking that. So it was really, really tough. But I feel, you know, like this is something that I felt responsible for doing, and I'm like was honored that people trusted me with their stories to tell in this book. I was afraid that no one would like trust me to talk to me about this. It is something that's been pretty terribly covered by media, so I understand that people are skeptical of journalists. That makes total sense. And especially doing it in comics, there's often a misunderstanding that it's going to be funny or that it's making light of the situation, which is not the kind of comics that this is. And so I was really, really honored that people trusted me to tell their stories. And I was really just working to do them justice.
Right. I mean, it was a difficult book to read, I'll be honest. I mean, the people that you interviewed, ones obviously that stood out most for me were I'm not going to use the word actually, the prisoners, Muazzam and Adeki. I think the way that you covered Muazzam was, like you said, it was very visceral, it was very dark, it was quite a heavy read. I mean, I found it difficult actually, because I had, you know, I've gone and assessed the human rights record in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the way that innocent lives and names have just completely been erased from history. So that kind of, it had an impact on me. It definitely hurt me immensely. And the way you set it out was good though. So I was, you know, talking about the intro, the language, the timeline. I like the way that you've explained how Guantanamo starts, you know, so maybe you could perhaps, I think that's really important that we do that to set the groundwork before we go into the book itself. Is if you could explain a little bit about how on earth is this place, this naval American base, how does it come to fruition, seeing it's on Cuban land? If you could give a little intro on that, please, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I was writing this book, I was thinking of my audience as being somebody who is like 20 years old or 22 years old, meaning that they were born after 9/11. So Guantanamo's been open their whole life. So for them, this prison might seem super normal. Might be like, oh, yes, I've been around my whole life. It's just a normal part of things here, to show how this prison was made by people and therefore can be unmade by people. And so that's why I wanted to set up the book with a little introduction of like, here's how this came to be, here's what it is, and here's just like the basic facts of the place. And then we can get into this story. But yeah, you know, the United States has had a military base on the south side of Cuba since like the early 1900s. It got the land in a lease from the, you know, the person who was in charge of Cuba before the revolution, and then after the Cuban Revolution, refused to give the land back despite many requests. And so, yeah, it's pretty odd that it's a U.S. military base in Cuba on Cuban land that we've been leasing for like 120 years. And it's basically like a strategic point. It's a joint task force base at the prison, meaning it's run by all branches of the military, 5 different branches of the military, but mostly the base is a naval base.
Right. And have there not been any protests from the Cuban government that this land is being used as a, you know, I mean, to be fair, it's an illegal prison, to be fair. Has there been any kind of protest or any?
Oh yeah, the Cuban government is very against the base and the prison. And so they ask every year for the base to be returned to them.
Okay.
And the US like sends a check every year to pay for the lease.
Right.
And the Cuban government supposedly refuses to cash the check. So
Okay.
they've been asking for the land back since the revolution.
Oh wow, that's a very interesting fact that I didn't know. So thank you for that. So okay, so you give the timeline in the book, and this is all very simply set out, and I can understand the audience now. You're trying to explain to just the average American the history behind Guantanamo and how it's been put together. And you're a single lone voice up against this well-oiled propaganda machine.
Yeah.
You know? And I'll come back. Yeah, so I'll come back to that. But what I found interesting was how you meet Chris Arend, who's a former guard at Guantanamo, and he has been kind of transferred from the military to spend, I think, a 6-month stint at Guantanamo. And he's the one that you have a picture of meeting, you know, one of the prisoners in meeting Muazzam, which I actually know about, which is a very interesting story in itself, and him making peace with Muazzam. Can you tell us a little bit about how you met and how you got interested in that story? Because that's really important to our
Yeah, so I love drawing comics, and so what I do like on the weekends is go and make comics and then photocopy them into like little booklets, like self-published magazines and publications that I make myself. And there's a collective studio space here in Portland called the Independent Publishing Resource Center. That's like a community hub for people that make and write books and art. And so I was there photocopying my little comics that I'd made, and at the photocopier next to me was Chris, and I didn't know them, but you know, they were photocopying something they'd made, and I was like, what is that? And they're like, oh, this is a zine about my time as a guard at Guantanamo Bay. And this was in 2008, fall of 2008. And I was like, what? What is happening? You know, and Chris has like a lot of tattoos and like had like a mohawk and was like very punk. And I was like, you don't look like somebody who would be in the military. And so we started talking and we became good friends, and talked a lot about, you know, their experiences at Guantanamo. And then so when they were invited to go on the speaking tour with Cage, I basically said, can I come along? Can I just tag along and keep a blog of this? And astoundingly, both Chris and Cage said yes. And so I traveled with them on that trip and got to keep the blog of the trip.
Right. I mean, you also talk about that you visited Guantanamo. So I think another very important question is Guantanamo, the way it was set out, like in that picture, those orange jumpsuits where these prisoners are not even allowed to take in oxygen. We talk about, you know, America talks about its human rights and it being the civilized West and the rest of it. And yet it doesn't, you know, it doesn't give these men the right to even breathe air properly. I mean, how much has Guantanamo changed from that initial picture in 2002 to your visit, which I think you said 2019, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So when it was first set up, the Camp X-Ray, those are basically like outdoor cages, like chain link fences.
Yeah. Right.
And you know, the guys who were in prison there compared them to like dog kennels because it's like a floor and chain link fence. It was very haphazard. Like they set this up, the military set this up very quickly and just were like, we're going to put people in here. And so it was very, very inhumane, just outdoor conditions in these cages. And since then they've built like prisons that are modeled on like supermax prisons for the United States. So have you ever seen like a TV show about prisons in the United States or documentaries? It's like gray fluorescent lighting, cement everywhere, and little cells. So now there's, it basically just feels like a regular prison in the United States, which I would argue is also inhumane, but it's indoor, it's not outside. And their access to everything is very tightly controlled. So one thing that the government likes to say is that they have art classes and they have a library and they have books, but all of that is like at the whim of the people who run the prison and can change at any moment. If there's a couple of really great memoirs of people who've been imprisoned at Guantanamo, including one by Mansour Adayfi, who's in the book. It says, "Don't forget us." It's called "Don't Forget Us Here," and the memoir was just so powerful and beautiful and funny and heartwarming. He talks a lot about how their access to things like making art would be expanded, and guys would be making lots of art to pass the time, and then suddenly one day the prison would crack down and say, "No more art, we're going to throw away everything you've made." And so that's the current situation, is like
so let me just get sorry, please continue.
The people who work there, like the military people who work there, their jobs only last like 6 months or a year, sometimes 2 years, but mostly 6 months or a year. So it's like every year there's like a new crew of people running the prison that come in, and they don't know the rules. They're new there. And so it's like a machine that's been set in motion 20 years ago, and there's nobody at the control panel. There's nobody running the machine. It's just running on its own, and the people who are like the cogs that are keeping it going have no idea what's going on. And oftentimes, the prisoners say that they know the rules better than the people that run the prison, and that it's extremely unclear what to do.
Yeah, I think that that may be because any group of people that are working there, anyone who spends too much time, just the damaging impact that could have on them, and the military probably doesn't want that on their head as well. Probably 6 month stint and then out, 6 month stint and then out, 6 months, and that really it's like a conveyor belt type of scenario. And then you've got people who are not being treated humanely. What would you say the treatment of the prisoners is now compared to, like, for instance, the earlier picture we saw of them in jumpsuits? I presume none of that's going on now, and the waterboarding, the torture methods that were being used. Maybe actually you could tell us what some of the torture methods were. That would be really important, because that's one of the things that is almost synonymous with Guantanamo, specifically, probably more so for us living in the UK, because that's how a lot of us see it. Maybe you could help explain that.
Sure. I'm always very hesitant about describing torture, because it's pretty difficult for people to hear, and I don't want to traumatize anybody who's listening. But just very briefly, some of the torture techniques include solitary confinement, so keeping people, imprisoned by themselves for days, months, or years. Waterboarding people, which I'm sure you've heard about. Playing extremely loud music so people can't sleep, keeping the lights on so they can't sleep, having teams of guards come into cells and grab people and move them from cells every few hours so that they can't sleep. If somebody's labeled as being not compliant in any way, busting in, spraying them with pepper spray, and then moving them to different cells and not allowing them to shower, so they have that like horrible pepper spray on their skin. Mansour in his book documents one that they left vacuums running outside of each cell for days and days and days, which maybe you wouldn't think sounds like a big deal, but then just imagine if there's like the sound of a vacuum going in your head for months and you can't communicate with the people around you, as well as stress positions, which means forcing people into very, very uncomfortable situations and like handcuffing or chaining them there so you can't move. And so those are some of the forms of torture that are documented in the book. And these days, the military supposedly doesn't do any of those things anymore at the prison. but what they do, but I would say, first of all, being imprisoned for years without charges is a form of torture.
Yeah.
So even though they're not waterboarding people now, for example, just being imprisoned and not knowing when you're going to be let out, or if you're ever going to be let out, that's a form of torture. And solitary confinement, which they still use, is a form of torture, as well as, you know, sometimes the only tool that people who are imprisoned have to protest is using their bodies. And so a lot of people at Guantanamo have gone on hunger strike over the years. And the government's response to that is to force feed people, which is also a form of torture. So those are some of the forms of torture that have happened at Guantanamo, and the ones that continue are sort of force feeding of people on hunger strike, solitary confinement, and just indefinite imprisonment.
Right. And how many people have actually died in Guantanamo, 779 prisoners that were there?
Yeah, as far as we know, 9 people have died there.
Right.
You know, so this all of the numbers for Guantanamo come from the government.
Right.
So you're not totally sure whether you can trust them or not. For example, like one basic question is how many juveniles have been at Guantanamo? How many young people were in prison there?
Right.
And it's between 15 and 23. It's not clear. We don't have a clear number on that. And so it's difficult as a journalist to be getting all of your statistics from the government when you can't trust them.
Yeah, I think another very important question is how were these prisoners transferred? And in your Guantanamo facts at the start of the book, you mentioned that 80% of them were turned over to the US for bounties. They had money in return. And naturally, it wasn't like their names were on some kind of ledger or list. So how were they being transferred over? Were people just saying, well, this guy's definitely a terrorist, or we'll take the money? How did that process take place?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk to people in the United States about Guantanamo, one of the lines that people always come back to me with is, oh, well, they must be in there for a reason. Like there must be a reason why they were imprisoned. And often the reason is money. And, you know, the United States offered bounties to be paid to people saying if they were accused of being a member of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, and they dropped leaflets over various countries saying, oh, we'll pay you a bunch of money if you turn in people who are members of these groups. And what that led to is basically people picking up anybody who was sort of an outsider in society. So some of the people who were turned over for bounties were students who were studying abroad in various countries, and didn't have a lot of connections, didn't have a lot of community, and like their neighbors turned them in and for bounties. Other people were turned in because of like land disputes or family disputes. It was a pretty convenient way to get rid of somebody who, if you wanted something that they had, or if you didn't like them. So a lot of people that were turned in for bounties like had, were on the outs with either their neighbors or family members or townspeople, or were just sort of like in a vulnerable position because they weren't really connected to their community and society in some way. And so somebody decided like, I'm going to grab this person and turn them in for a bounty.
I mean, that's absolutely horrific. You've got people who literally could just be, anyone could be turned in, and then they're transported to what is clearly an illegal prison, which is out of international law. Any kind of jurisdiction has its own set of rules and regulations. And then that these men don't even get, proper, they don't get, proper justice. I mean, it's just a crazy kind of timeline for an individual who probably has done nothing wrong. And there's like, about 800 of these men. And you've still got, unfortunately, like you stated, Americans who have no idea. But I think one of the most important things is it's just, I don't know what else to say to you, but to thank you for your immense work in this field and to make it something that is easily understandable for an audience that otherwise wouldn't understand it. So thank you so much. I've just been alerted that we have a minute left. So I have some really important questions. Where do you think Guantanamo is going to go in the future? Because that's a really important question. What do you think is going to happen to Guantanamo?
I'm hoping that the prison closes and that we have some sort of accountability and reconciliation process. The historical precedent I look to for this is the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II. During World War II in the United States, the government imprisoned thousands of Japanese people. And it took 40 years for the government to apologize for that. It took 40 years. The government eventually apologized and paid reparations to those families. but it was a really long time. It took a cultural change, it took a political change to see that as wrong. And I feel like that might be where what we're seeing with Guantanamo too, is it might take a really long time for our government to recognize that what we did was wrong, and for our society to recognize that this is wrong.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I'm just wondering if, it's a question from the audience. In your opinion, while doing your research, did you find a common denominator with regards to biased politicians?
Yeah, one sad thing about this is that both Democrats and Republicans can be pretty pro Guantanamo. So when Obama was trying to close the prison, it was both Democrats and Republicans who teamed up to block that. And so I would say the common denominator is like racism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and that it's a pretty easy campaign pitch for politicians to say, like, I'm against terrorists, and so I'm pro Guantanamo. So you don't have a lot of politicians at the federal level saying, let's stop this.
Right. Okay. What would you do differently in writing this book now? I think that's another very important question. It's because obviously there's a lot of budding writers and authors out there. So what would you do different? I know that there's a chapter towards the end on how the book was made and kind of put together, the illustrations and how you edited the interviews. And you are both the author and the editor. And although the illustrations were something that you got illustrators to do, and you did the initial illustrations yourself as well. So but what would you do differently?
I would say that, like, to write a book, it's really helpful to have a community around you to support you. So in this book, I wrote it pretty much like on my own and was just communicating with the artists online. But for any book, it's super, super stressful and takes a long time. And so to find a community or build a community around you that can support you while you're writing the book, that you can talk to about it, people who are equally obsessed or will listen to you talk about it, that would have been really helpful for me, is having a community around me to support this.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sarah. It was a very, very interesting book, very well laid out, by the way. So for the average person, the layman, to understand. Thank you so much for your contribution to this field, and God bless you for this hard work, and good luck with the future. Thank you so much.